So, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the things we found through the years on Eagles Island, and particularly, now I'm going to skip along here. Okay, so as Roger said, I'm going to be speaking on this side, on the eastern side, across from Wilmington, where a lot of the industrial artifacts are, shipwrecks or derelicts, and Oscar will take us on the other side. And this is a special place for me because 50 years ago, this summer, is where I first started learning about underwater archaeology. I had a degree in archaeology or anthropology from Wake Forest, and my professor said, "You like scuba diving, why don't you go to this field school down with UNCW and in the branch down at Fort Fisher." And that's me in the blue bandana there. And they took us out on the first couple days to a shipwreck. We didn't have to dive because there it is. And you can see it today. It's right below the Memorial Bridge, right across from Nunn Street at low tide. And it's really cool. As budding archaeologists, underwater archaeologists, we could explore like we would if we had all our scuba gear on. We weren't sure what it was. They thought it was maybe the Sylvan Grove, which was a nice excursion steamer that went from Wilmington down to Smithfield. And so that sort of brought our attention back in the 70s, but eventually we decided to register all these sites. And the cool thing is that it's part of the National Register of Historic Places, the Wilmington District. They extended it over 100 feet onto Eagles Island because of the view site, to protect the view. And so it was pretty easy for us just to add those sites, which we did, 37 shipwrecks. I call them shipwrecks. They're mostly derelicts, laid up vessels that have just been abandoned. I'm going to get this right. And so why are these things? And Roger covered this. One of the things is there was a crossing over Eagles Island. That was the main way to get from the south to the north. And continually operated ferries like these until the 20th century. And then up until the 60s, we had these ferries. I rode on one of these ferries in San Diego, very similar car ferry. John Knox, and you can see part of John Knox there in the right-hand corner, the decking there sticking up, if you're observant. And as Roger said, again, they didn't have space on Wilmington side, and certainly some of this was nasty products that they were shipping out, mainly naval stores and lumber. And so it naturally went across the river, but not so naturally, actually, because it was very swampy and sandy and wet. So what we see is the way to build these harbors up, is to bring in old boats and fill them with ballast or rubble, or even build wooden cribs. And you can create more or less high ground. It might flood, get sand in there. You might have a source of sand. So that's what they used. And again, you see the tremendous amount of shipping. And the lumber and naval stores was huge. It basically built the British Navy. There was also shipbuilding, as Roger said. The CSS North Carolina was built over there. There were these two very large four-masted schooners that were built in World War I in the shipyard there. So that was a certain activity you could see. And it continued to build through the years. There were tugboat businesses over there, stone towing. And it would sort of come and go with the Depression, but it was a busy place. And then the state ports in the 1950s moved south, and that pretty much laid up a lot of the need for that area. There's a few things going on, but not much. And the battleship came in, and it was squeezed in there. An amazing feat that apparently blocked the river for a very scary amount of time. So, as I said, this is an area that's just loaded with relics of all kinds that represent all the activities that were taking place there. You have a number of workboats, both steamboats and diesel operated. You can see that they're built in the 1800s. Some of them, most of them were probably built for other things like the Stone 3, but then eventually as they got older, they became workboats, tugboats. Lots and lots of barges because that's what they were shipping out and using, especially to bring stuff in down to the port. And yes, we found little boats that they had laid up in there, little skiffs, and people rowing up there at the Hilton Bridge. And there still was evidence of shipways. This is Stone's repair yard there in the bottom. But it was a hopping place. So when we did the 1985 inventory, we brought down specialists from Smithsonian, from the Mariners Museum. All these guys, we came in and they were very impressed. This is an unusual trove of artifacts and collections that were just sort of, time moved on and they were left there. So our job early on was simply to record them, measure them, and get them on the map for the National Register protection. The state claims any artifacts that have been abandoned for 10 years and a day, and that's up to the high tide mark. So a lot of these are state property. They're not private property that lay in there. It has attracted several, a lot of work from East Carolina, who has a maritime history program, and in particularly Sammy Sieb did her thesis on these wrecks and sort of taking it to another level. And one of the things she was trying to see was, when were these abandoned? What's going on? Why? And you can see early on that there was just sort of a little pocket there in the south, on the south end. That's where the Eagles Island steamer, the first one is, and a few were with it. But then maybe there were some downturns in the early 20th century. Then the Depression, you really see them added. And then after the war, when the state ports move out, the area is littered and is really not a working place. There's also things that she could determine and research. There were other processes, man-made or accidental, that were reducing this archaeological evidence, and some of it was fire. During World War II, there was certainly a lot of metal salvage. The Japanese needed our metal for their bombs, and later on we did. So all these things a lot of them were cut down to the waterline to salvage, to sell, and for the war effort. But then in 2011, and the cost of metals went way up, and it was lucrative for some of these people to come in. This is state property, it's illegal, but they came in. You see the barge on the top left, and they didn't want the boiler, but they were caught hauling off the mechanical part of it, and the state repossessed it, and they had to pay a fine. So I want to talk about a couple boats over there, and one is the A.W. Wright. You see it lived a long time. It was what they call a snag boat, a work boat that could take out obstructions but could help build lock and dams, and et cetera. And there are the two pictures you see as it was when we first got there. It had been bought by the Stone brothers, used as a workboat a little bit and then pulled up on their railway and was just an office building and where they ate lunch. And so we felt strongly that this was a resource that we should recover and not leave out to the whims of nature and man. So we engaged Dave Carnell. I don't know if you all remember Dave. He was a great maritime engineer or documentary, and he helped get us the information. Donald Bordeaux, he owned this salvage stone, the salvage company over there in Point Peter. He's one of those people that actually lived it and worked it over there, and he came down. And so we removed parts, one of which was the paddle wheel. And a real quick aside, you see how that middle picture, the paddle wheel is rotten on the bottom, and they realized that what was down in the mud was getting eaten up by the microbes in the mud. And that was news to Frank Conlon, director of the battleship, and that's why the battleship has had to get this armor replaced. They thought it was safe and sound in that slipway, but it's actually very detrimental to the metal. The paddle, all the machinery was put in a big oven and heated to get the salts out of it and get it stabilized. And then the restoration started. And we happened to have another volunteer, Jerry Dunn, who was an electrician, but he was a wizard. He was a mechanical wizard. And he got this running off of compressed air, so it literally made this sawing as the paddle wheel went around. And it was on display at the Cape Fear Museum, and it is still available. It's not there on display, but maybe it could be put back on the island at some point. And then I want to go back to the CFR 001, where I cut my teeth in the business. And you see it there in 1920, and you see it's in bad shape. It's a derelict, but it's still got its boiler, and you faintly can see the paddle wheels. And so we know that during World War II, that it had been one of the sites for this extensive salvage. The fellows looked at it but didn't know. The experts said it's very important, but they didn't know the name of it. So I happened to get involved with Baker, Charlie Baker. He was an academically gifted teacher out in Pender County, and he had these kids that we could use and not abuse, but use for this research. You'll see we got them out in the muck. But here they are spending one day down at the lab at Fort Fisher learning about underwater archaeology, and there's Charlie. And then we went out, and it was great one day, and they took measurements and tried to be serious, but at times it was just a place where you just sunk up to your crotch in mud at times. But they did some important measurements, remeasurements, and looking, and they did come up with a conclusion that it wasn't the Sylvan Grove. That's a walking beam engine, and this was an inclined engine. So they knocked that one out as a candidate, but we had several others just based on the style and the length. And so we happened to get up with my good friend Bill Reeves, who, as many of you know, is a great Wilmington historian. And he said, well, I've got this box that has some good information on all the ships that came in and out of Wilmington, but I need your help. And that's when we moved all his stuff from 3rd Street to down to the library. Thankfully, it's been saved now, but there was a lot of roaches and silverfish, and the kids, that was worse than being out in the muck. But sure enough, he did have a box, and they started going through these different files, the 5 or 6 they had, and one of them happened to be a file on the Waccamaw. And as if you see there that it says that it was laid up right across from Nunn Street, and it was spotted burning. And then just before that, some probably middle school kids were rowing across. So it placed it right there in that location. And then it said that it, by the way, it was a government gunboat at one point. So in doing more research, we realized it was the USS Commodore Hull, which had a very active time up in the Albemarle Sound area, particularly, and did have battle with the CSS Albemarle and did its service. But it turns out that it was confiscated by the Union. It was actually a ferry boat built for some Cuban owners in 1861. It was detained on the way down by the Confederates. They released it, but they put on letters of requesting supplies for the war effort. It was then detained by the Union down at Port Royal, and they found these letters and they confiscated the boat, took it away. And we know a lot about this because the Cuban owners took the U.S. to court, and it ended up in the Supreme Court 20 years later, and they won with interest. But after it was Commodore Hull, it was sold and decommissioned and came to the Waccamaw, and it was a beautiful excursion boat, again going down to Smithfield and Southport, and had some good times, some sort of scary times. It had a gunfight at one time, and the lady passed out. She was so frightened, and then it became a workboat and was laid up there. So that's what I wanted to tell you, is that stretch between the battleship North Carolina and the battleship USS Commodore Hall, ex Nuestra Señora Lake de Regla, is loaded with sites and things that can interpret the history, human behavior. It's got all kinds of educational opportunities. So maybe someday, we're waiting for good things to happen, but maybe someday there'll be a boardwalk along there or some way, overlook, that we can interpret those sites as well. So thank you.